Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you also to Jeremy and Julian, Jennifer and Andreas. It's very nice to be here. I'm not going to say very much about Hume, actually, in this talk, but then you've heard quite a lot about Hume already, so maybe that's okay. So here we have my two favourite philosophers, Lewis and Hume. What's the connection between them is kind of the question that I'm interested in. Here are some things they have in common. They're both called David. They both have the property, is one of my two favourite philosophers. Do they have any more in common than that, is the question. You might think the obvious answer to that is, well, yeah, because look, Lewis named his kind of overarching philosophical thesis that he wanted to defend, Humean Supervenience. So obviously what Lewis says has something to do with Hume. But I want to try and cash that thought out in a little bit more detail and try and get to the heart of what, if anything, is so Humean about Humean supervenience. So let's start with the question, what is Humean supervenience? There are some historians in the room, so they may not have memorized this quote. Very famous quote from Lewis in the introduction to his second volume of philosophical papers. Humean supervenience is named in honour of the greater denier of necessary connections. It's the doctrine that all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. We have an arrangement of qualities and that is all. There's no difference without difference in the arrangement of qualities. All else supervenes on that, right? So we have a very, very sparse supervenience base, basically an arrangement of qualities that take no more than a point to be instantiated. We have a system of spatio-temporal relations. That's it. So all the other facts about the world, all the facts about minds, mental states, causality, laws of nature, chairs and tables, everything supervenes on that very minimal base. Now, I've put greater denier in bold here because it struck me a while ago that this passage gets misquoted very, very frequently. And what people tend to say is that Humean supervenience is named in honour of the great denier of necessary connections and not the greater denier of necessary connections. So I did a little Google search earlier for the passage, Humean supervenience is named in honour of the great/greater denier of necessary connections. I found 354 hits for great denier, that's the misquote, and 32 for the real quote, one of which was Lewis's Philosophical Papers, Volume 2. So that takes it down effectively to 31. So like about 11 to 1, the misquotes are beating the genuine quotes. And so I thought that was kind of very odd, because it's always struck me as kind of obvious. I mean, obvious in the sense of intuitively compelling, if not actually true, that the denial of necessary connections kind of lies at the heart of Lewis's philosophy. So it struck me as really odd that so many people, in knocking the ER off the greater, kind of must be not obvious to them, otherwise they wouldn't make that mistake, right? So in a sense, what I want to do in this talk is try and spell out how that denial of necessary connections kind of lies at the heart of Humean supervenience and is kind of the connection between the thesis of Humean supervenience and Hume's own view. Now, here are some kind of reasons to worry that Humean supervenience isn't really a very Humean thesis at all. Humean with a... So when I use the word Humean here, I mean Humean... When I say Humean supervenience, I mean that thesis. When I say Humean, I mean has some connection with, actual Hume. Here's one reason to be suspicious. Humean supervenience is supposed to be a contingent matter. It holds at our world, so Lewis thinks, and also nearby ones, but not at all possible worlds. Perhaps more importantly, it's supposed to be it's an explicitly ontological thesis, right? Hume, I don't think, is that fussed about ontology. He's much more interested in genetic and epistemological questions. So you might think there's really not much going for the thought that Humean supervenience actually connects with Hume in any interesting way. But I want to argue that there is a genuinely Humean core to Humean supervenience, and that is on the issue of necessary connections. So I want to argue that as far as necessary connections in particular are concerned, Lewis agrees with Hume, I've said implicitly, but actually he kind of does it explicitly, agrees with Hume about our cognitive limitations that we've been hearing about today. So I want to claim that Lewis really does think that natural necessity, in some Humean supervenience violating way, is an unintelligible notion, right? So now, what we mean by unintelligible is something that I'll come back to at the end, but the idea shared by a lot of people who work on Hume, although obviously not all of them, that the notion of necessary connection is just an unintelligible notion. I think that's something that Lewis probably understood shares. Okay, so now for some reason, let's start again. Right, so here's roughly what I'm going to do. I'm going to start out by thinking about the scope of Humean supervenience, what sorts of entities are kind of ruled in and ruled out by that thesis, and ask whether there's any interesting connection with Hume there. The answer to that question is kind of going to be no, really, except when it comes to natural necessity. There are some sort of commonalities between some things that Hume says and some things that Lewis says, but the most you really get when it comes to most Humean supervenient entities is a kind of like vague analogy. You don't really get anything particularly interestingly in common. And then I'm going to talk about the fact that Humean supervenience is a contingent ontological thesis, and again, that casts some doubt on the thought that there's anything very interesting in common between Lewis and Hume. And then I want to talk about what I think is the exception, which is, as I've said, natural necessity. And I want to claim that Lewis regards natural necessity as genuinely unintelligible, and that is kind of the authentically Humean heart of Humean supervenience. There's a lot else going on in Humean supervenience that isn't particularly obviously Humean, but I think when it comes to necessary connections, Lewis really is a card-carrying Humean with the capital H. Galen Strawson sent me a draft of a paper recently where he argued that the word Humean as used in contemporary metaphysics to mean people who don't believe in necessary connections should be spelt with a small h rather than a large h, to make the point that that's not Hume's view because Galen is a sceptical realist. Fortunately, our other speakers here are not signed up to sceptical realism, so I propose to ignore that interpretation of Hume. Sorry. If you are a sceptical realist about Hume, you will disagree with all the stuff I say about the commonalities between Lewis and Hume, right? According to you, there will be no point of connection between them. I think that's the conclusion you should draw from the paper. Okay, so what sorts of entities does Humean supervenience rule out? This is a very much non-exhaustive but just sort of indicative list of the kinds of things that it rules out. Seems to rule out dualism. Souls don't have a location at all and hence don't have any kind of point size location, it seems. Irreducible mental properties violate the point size instantiation requirement, so Humean supervenience seems to force physicalism on us. The kind of more interesting category that Humean supervenience rules out is intrinsic relations, right? So no intrinsic relations in the supervenient space. The only relations that you get between our point size matters of particular fact are spatiotemporal relations in the supervenient space. So you could have intrinsic relations between objects, as it were, higher up in the pecking order, but there aren't any in the supervenient space. What sorts of things does that rule out? It rules out enduring entities. So Lewis's theory of persistence is a per-durantist account and not an endurantist account. Why are enduring entities ruled out? Well, okay, so suppose Eric is on a crash diet. He weighs 280 pounds on Monday and 270 pounds on Tuesday. That is quite a crash diet, isn't it, actually? How can we make sense of that? The fact that here we have this object that had one property at one time and this other property at the next time. This is the problem of temporary intrinsics. Lewis says, look, if we think that Eric is an enduring entity, persists over time by being wholly present at every moment at which he exists, then we can only make sense of his change in properties by holding that there's some intrinsic irreducible relation between Eric and Monday. That's the kind of the weighing 280 pounds at relation. And then some different irreducible intrinsic relation between Eric and Tuesday, the weighing 270 pounds at relation. That violates our ban on intrinsic relations. So instead we need to think of objects as perduring through time rather than enduring. The ban on intrinsic relations rules out fundamental dispositions, so it can't be on Lewis's view that the property of having negative charge, say, insofar as if that's supposed to be a dispositional property, a disposition to attract things with positive charge and to repel things with negative charge, then it must have some categorical basis that explains its behaviour. It can't be that dispositional feature is a fundamental irreducible feature of reality. And it also rules out necessary connections in the supervenient space, right? So again, necessary connections would be an intrinsic relation, and so ruled out. So necessary connections either as a basis for laws or for causation, or indeed for anything else for that matter. So how does that compare with Hume? Well, this is kind of a bit hand-wavy and in a way not hugely important, but anyway, so on Hume's view, I take it irreducible mental states are okay. He's not committed to physicalism. Soul's definitely not fine for Hume, or I say definitely, on some interpretations not fine for Hume. As we all know, Hume thinks that we don't have any impression of a thing that owns our mental states. You introspect and all you experience is this fleeting succession of perceptions. You can draw a sort of rough analogy between sort of Hume's bundle theory, if that's the view that he has of the self, and Lewis's story about persistence. So you think about the way that these loose and separate perceptions are supposed to kind of, as it were, be bound together over time to constitute a single persisting self. That's kind of quite similar to Lewis's story about persistence, right? So, an ontological story about persistence. So, what is it by virtue of which, as it were, me tomorrow is the same person as me today? Well, look, here is a temporal part at time 1, there's another temporal part at time 2. They stand in causal relations to one another of a certain kind. That's what makes it the case that we're both parts of the very same person. If you think about what sort of binds the perceptions together at a time, less of a clear analogy, I think, with Lewis, but you might sort of think of mental states as kind of parts of the mind at a time, and then you could have a sort of mereological account of what the mind is. It's somehow just the thing that's composed of all of these parts. This is all very hand-wavy. The thought is, look, there are some loose analogies between some parts of Lewis's positive view, the sorts of story that he needs to give in order to be consistent with Humean supervenience, and some things you get in Hume, right? You get the idea in Hume that we have these loose and separate qualities that are sort of bound together in certain sorts of ways and so on, but it's a very loose analogy, right? In this case, Hume's talking about the nature of the self, whereas the analogy holds between that and a kind of a story about the persistence and mereological kind of summation of objects. So all very loose. We're not really finding any particularly sort of Humean story going on here in Lewis. If you think about enduring entities, hugely problematic issue for Hume, obviously, in his discussion about skepticism about the external world. But again, you can think of Lewis's positive account of persistence as sort of broadly analogous to some things that Hume gestures towards, right? So again, Hume's worrying about how we piece together the idea of persistent mind-independent objects out of this succession of fleeting impressions. Again, Lewis has a kind of ontological version of that, right? Persistent objects are pieced together from a succession of fleeting temporal parts. So there's a sort of an analogous view there. But again, it's very weak and raises the general issue. I mean, here's Lewis giving a kind of an ontological story about what it is that persistence in objects consists in. That's not really the issue that Hume's worried about. Hume's worried about, the origin of our idea of a persisting object and correspondingly our belief in the external world. I'll come back to that. Okay, so slightly firmer foundations when we think about fundamental dispositions and necessary connections. If you think of fundamental dispositions as just kind of powers of objects, then Hume, like Lewis, does seem to ban those. At least he thinks that we don't have any idea of powers in the objects. And he, like Lewis, assimilates them to the category of necessary connection, right? So Hume would seem to ban those again in the sense that he at least thinks that we can't really make very much sense of the idea that there could be natural necessity as a relation between mind-independent objects. So we don't have anything very conclusive to go on yet. The closest that we've got to a kind of Humean heart of Humean supervenience is agreement, some kind of agreement with Hume when it comes to natural necessity and dispositions. Okay, so a worry that one might have about any connection between Humean supervenience on the one hand and Hume on the other is that Humean supervenience is a contingent ontological thesis. That doesn't really seem to connect up with anything that Hume is interested in at all. So Humean supervenience, as I said, is contingent. Lewis is very upfront about the fact that he thinks that it's empirically falsifiable. It could turn out, he thinks, that quantum mechanics violates Humean supervenience. Maybe there are kind of unlocalized fundamental physical entities, in which case the supervenience space is going to have to include more than just these local matters of particular facts, right? If we turn out not to have locality. Lewis's response to that worry is basically to say, well, okay, come back to me when you've solved the measurement problem, and then I'll pay attention to whether quantum mechanics shows that Humean supervenience is false. So he's kind of not too worried about it. But also does make the point that he's kind of not so much concerned to try and argue that Humean supervenience is true, but as to argue that it's just it's a viable philosophical thesis, right? A second aspect to the contingency of Humean supervenience is that Lewis gives a kind of Canberra plan functionalist story about lots of entities. So if you think about mental states, Lewis gives a functionalist account of mental states. So what is it to be in pain? It's to be in some state or other that has certain typical causes and effects. If you think of that as what it is to be in pain, then you get the result that physicalism only turns out to be contingently true. Right? In the actual world and similar worlds, the things that realize that functional property, the things that turn out to be caused and be caused by certain kinds of phenomena and have certain kinds of effects, are physical states, they're states of the brain, but of course in other possible worlds they could easily be mental states that play that causal role. So that sort of Canberra plan style story about what it is to be a mental state or whatever it is one that's supposed to shore up the kind of contingent nature of Humean supervenience, right? That role is played as it, in fact, in the actual world by physical things, could be played by mental things. Oh, there we go, okay. That's what I just said. So, as I said, Lewis's concern really is ontological. His question is what exists. He wants to know what exists at the actual world and indeed at all other possible worlds. Hume's primary concerns are not ontological, I claim. They're primarily genetic and epistemological. He wants to know how beliefs and ideas arise, what the limits of our ideas and hence our beliefs are, what, if anything, legitimates our beliefs. Very different kinds of question to Lewis, right? Hume doesn't very often explicitly address the question of what exists, except insofar as he's interested in what our beliefs are about what exists. So far, seems to me that the best that we could hope for is some sort of rough analogy between Lewis's ontological views and Hume's genetic and epistemological views. So, for example, what I said about Lewis's account of persistence kind of looks a little bit like some things that Hume says about the existence of mind-independent objects. That's really not authentically Humean at all. So we don't seem to have got very far. But luckily, I think there's an exception to all of this, and that is when it comes to natural necessity. So let's agree on the following claims about Hume. I'm going to come back to these later. But let's take Hume's view to be something like this. Purely metaphysical speculation about the nature and existence of necessary connections should be consigned to the flames. It's at best pointless, and at worst, what was the expression Don used? It's just gargling. I think that was the expression. There isn't even a legitimate concept of mind-independent necessary connection in terms of which that kind of speculation might be conducted. All talk of mind-independent necessary connections is meaningless. I'm laying it a little bit thick, Don in particular, I take it, and various other people might not sign up to anything quite as strong as this, but I shall come back to that, as I say, later on. So, that's something like Hume's view, unless you're a sceptical realist, obviously. That all seems really orthogonal to Lewis's concerns. So, it looks as though for Lewis, the question, are there any necessary connections in nature, is going to be like any other ontological question about non-Humean supervenient entities. Looks as though it's going to be a meaningful question, and it's going to get at best a contingent answer. The contingent answer is going to be no in Lewis's case, but it looks like it's going to be a merely contingent answer. So it doesn't look as though there's any room here, given the contingent and ontological nature of the claim of Humean supervenience, for Lewis to have anything like an authentically Humean view. However, So not however yet. So as we've seen, Humean Supervenience is a contingent thesis. Lewis thinks that there are possible worlds where there are enduring entities, souls, and other such like rubbish. However, here I think is an extremely important point. Humean Supervenience is not merely contingent when it comes to necessary connections. So when Lewis is talking about the places where you might expect natural necessity to play a role, he doesn't give a kind of functionalist Canberra plan type story. He gives us a full-on all possible worlds conceptual analysis. So, in particular, his accounts of causation and laws, they're reductive analyses, they're not Canberra plan style analyses. So just to give you a very quick summary of how these theories go, Lewis's account of laws is a best system account. It's in effect a sophisticated version of the regularity theory. Take the distribution of matters of particular fact across the whole of space and time. There'll be a whole bunch of regularities there. Which are the laws of nature? The laws of nature are those regularities. Statements of law are those generalizations that play a role in the simplest and strongest axiomatization possible of the matters of particular fact that prevail. Right? We have this distribution of matters of particular fact. There are going to be lots of true generalizations about that distribution. Some of them are going to be very boring. None of the objects on this table are made of cheese. Everyone in this room is under the age of 95, and so on and so on, very dull. Some of the generalizations are going to be incredibly widespread and interesting. Generalizations about subatomic particles, for example. Those generalizations, the ones that say interesting things about subatomic particles and so on, are going to be the laws, not by virtue of having any special ontological status, but simply by virtue of being extremely powerful and interesting generalizations. Lewis's account of causation is a story according to which causation is, roughly speaking, a matter of counterfactual dependence. So if the cause hadn't happened, the effect wouldn't have happened either. What gives us the truth conditions for counterfactuals? It's a matter of what happens at the closest possible world, what determines the closeness relation between possible worlds. It's the similarity metric. What determines similarity? It's the distribution of matters of particular fact plus the laws of nature. Now, we've just seen that the laws of nature, what the laws of nature are, is just a matter of some subset of the regularities, and then we have the distribution of particular matters of fact. Those are how those stories go. So in both cases, it looks like there isn't any conceptual space for natural necessity to play any role in determining the truth of claims about laws or causation. So think about laws. Imagine that it's intelligible to suppose that there's a possible world that has natural necessity in it. The laws, what would determine what the laws are in that world? It would be what the best axiomatization of all the matters of particular fact is, right? It's reductive analysis. Necessary connections just wouldn't play any role at all. It could easily be, if we could imagine there being a possible world with necessary connections in it. Suppose there are some necessary connections distributed in that world. The laws may or may not connect with the regularities that are in some sense underpinned by those necessary connections, right? That depends on how predictively powerful and interesting and so on the regularities that are underpinned by those necessary connections are. Could easily turn out that lots of the laws of nature turn out to not be underpinned by necessary connections. And that lots of the regularities that are underpinned by necessary connections turn out not to be laws. Similarly with causation, suppose there were somehow necessary connections between events, between pairs of events in some possible world. That wouldn't play any role in the grounding the truth of counterfactuals, because what grounds the truth of counterfactuals is a matter of the distribution of matters of particular fact plus the laws of nature, right? And again, what the laws of nature are itself just depends on the distribution of matters of particular fact. So again, suppose there were some sort of connection between certain kinds of pairs of events, whether or not that happens to correspond to the truth of claims of the form C cause D is just a kind of, that depends how the chips fall, right? So there's just no conceptual space in all of this for natural necessity to play a role in the truth conditions for causal claims and claims about laws of nature. So that strikes me as a good reason to think that when it comes to natural necessity, Lewis has a very different attitude towards natural necessity to the attitude that he has towards things like minds and enduring entities, right? In the case of things like souls and enduring entities and other such like rubbish. He thinks that these things do exist at other possible worlds. It's just also he hopes they don't exist at the actual world or worlds like it. When it comes to causation and laws, he switches to giving reductive analyses in such a way that just make it impossible for anything like natural necessity to play any role in the determinants of the truth conditions, the determinants of the truth of causal claims and claims about what the laws are. Another, and this sort of, in a sense, I think this is kind of obvious, but as I said, lots of people misquote that, so maybe it's not so obvious. As it were, another piece of evidence that Lewis is quite authentically Humean in some sense here. Natural necessity, for example, Armstrong's relation N stands for necessity, obviously, that's supposed to relate universals, and it's the relation N between universals that grounds the laws that constitutes the laws of nature for Armstrong. So that's really genuine natural necessity. That's intra-world necessity, right? You take a possible world and you can coherently ask whether there's any necessity in it, right? And whether there's any necessity in it, it amounts to the question whether a particular universal is instantiated, right? The universal that is the relation of necessity. That's a necessity that would, as it were, be an inhabitant of a particular possible world. So by definition, the obtaining of necessary connections in that sense isn't going to get a possible world analysis, right? Because by definition, if you have a possible world analysis of some modal claim, that's going to be an interworld analysis, right? Facts about whether something is possible or necessary or whatever in a possible world get cashed out in terms of what's going on in other possible worlds on a possible world analysis modality. Natural necessity can't be analysed in that way by definition because it's supposed to be necessity that obtains within a possible world. But, of course, well, I say of course, the major point of Lewis's possible world semantics for modality is precisely to eschew into intra-world modality, right? So why should we believe in all of these possible worlds? Lewis's central answer to that question, I think, is so that we don't have to postulate any necessity as a constituent of any possible world, right? Take any modal claim you like, any claim that invokes concepts like necessity, possibility, counterfactual dependence, whatever it is, that claim, the modal aspect of that claim is going to get filtered out by our possible world analysis, right? So any claim, for Lewis, any claim with modal import is going to be given a possible world analysis, right? That's just what the possible world analysis modality does. Natural necessity, by definition, defies any such analysis. And so I think that gives us fairly good reason to think that on Lewis's view, natural necessity is just unintelligible. So the reason why Lewis doesn't think that it's a contingent matter whether it exists is because he just can't make any sense of the notion. Why can't he make any sense of the notion? Because it would have to be intra-world modality. And precisely what the possible world's account of modality is supposed to be is to be an account according to which there is no intra-world modality. There couldn't be any intra-world modality because modality just is a feature to be determined by the relations between different possible worlds. Okay, so that's kind of indirect evidence for the thought that Lewis holds that natural necessity is unintelligible. Here's some slightly more direct evidence. Again, this is talking about Armstrong's view of laws. What leads me to reject Armstrong's theory, Lewis says, is that I find its necessary connections unintelligible. I say that N deserves the name of necessitation only if somehow it really can enter into the requisite necessary connections. It can't enter into them just by bearing a name, joke alert, any more than one can have mighty biceps just by being called Armstrong. I can't actually remember what Lewis 1983 is. Is that new work for theory of universals? I can't remember. Anyway, yes, thank you. I suggest that we read this as a genuinely Humean complaint that the notion of necessary connection, where what we're attempting to do by using that expression is pick out some irreducible intrinsic intra-world relation, is just meaningless, right? He does say unintelligible, and I think we should hold him to that. Here's, in some sense, an even stronger claim. I'm tempted to complain, he says, in Humean fashion, of alleged necessary connections between distinct existences, especially when first-order states of affairs in the past supposedly join with second-order states of affairs to necessitate first-order states of affairs in the future. You can blank that out if you don't know anything about Armstrong on laws. That complaint's not clearly right. The sharing of universals detracts from the distinction the distinctness of the necessitating and the necessitated state of affairs, but I am not appeased. I conclude that necessary connections can be unintelligible even when they're supposed to obtain between existences which are not clearly and wholly distinct. So again, we have the unintelligibility claim here. Okay, so I think that's good reason for attributing to Lewis the view that, in some sense at least, the notion of natural necessity is unintelligible, and I take it that that's a view that he shares with Hume. So, to sum up what I think their relative positions here are, Hume, I take it, thinks that our talk of necessity is perfectly meaningful so long as we don't take ourselves to be hooking onto a feature of mind-independent reality, right? As soon as you try and use the word necessity to hook onto some intrinsic relation between causes and effects, you start talking gibberish. Lewis thinks that our talk of necessity is perfectly meaningful so long as we don't take ourselves to be hooking onto an intrinsic feature of the actual world or indeed any possible world, right? As soon as you try and use the word necessity to hook onto some intrinsic feature, some intra-world feature, then you're talking nonsense. Because if we did try and do that, we'd be attempting to refer to a species of necessity that just defies possible world semantics, but it's conceptually impossible for such a species of necessity to exist once you're signed up to possible world semantics, right? There could be no notion of necessity that defies Lewis's possible world semantics full modal claims. So at least in this sense, it seems to me, Lewis is genuinely Humean when it comes to necessary connections. No empirical evidence or philosophical argument could convince us of the existence of such a thing, except, I suppose, a philosophical argument that showed that the possible world analysis of modality was wrong. But given that account of the meaning of modal claims, no philosophical arguments could convince us of the existence. Hence, we should consign all talk of necessary connections, qua intrinsic features of any possible world, to the flames. So, this talk's way too quick. I want to return to an issue that has kind of come up a little bit during the day already, which is the extent to which Hume has kind of there's conceptual space within Hume's philosophy to refer to, suppose the existence of some feature of reality that in some sense might glue causes and effects together and thereby underpin the regularities that we observe around us. So I take it that Don and Jennifer are both signed up to the thought that if we can meaningfully, in some sense, pick these connections out by supposing that they exist or whatever, nonetheless, the existence or not of those things is completely idle with respect to our causal talk, right? It just doesn't matter whether they exist or not for the purposes of determining whether our claims to the effect that C cause D are true or false, right? Nonetheless, there's a question about whether we can so much as suppose or imagine that there could be such connections. So, and what I want to do is kind of, as it were, I think there's an interpretative issue here, and I kind of think that you get a similar interpretative issue when you think about Lewis. So now skeptical realists are a diverse bunch. They don't all sign up to the same claims, but one claim they do sign up to when it comes to Hume is the idea that it's at least possible that it's epistemically possible that there could be some necessary connections between causes and effects, right? It's an intelligible thought that there could be such relations. Galen Strawson thinks of causation with a capital C as being that relation by virtue of which the regularities of nature obtain, right? So when we make our causal claims, Strawson thinks, although, as it were, the evidence base for those claims is just the regularities, what makes those claims true is the existence of this kind of regularity underpinning feature of reality in the relation between causes and effects. That's what I mean by a kind of causation underpinning relation. So grant that skeptical realism is off the table, we can still ask the question whether we can, in our talk and thought, if not in our causal talk and thought, reach out and refer to these necessary connections, even though we've accepted that they don't play any role in determining the truth of our causal claims. So could there be some intrinsic relation between C and E, the properties C and E, or the kinds of events C and E, in virtue of which these two kinds of events are constantly conjoined. Does that make any sense? So now, views on this differ. I'm not mentioning skeptical realists, as I say. There's a kind of stronger view, which in some moods I endorse, which is this. What kinds of causation underpinning relation could there in principle be? None whatsoever, according to Hume. Right? We simply lack the conceptual resources to so much as conceive of what such kind of underpinning might be, what it might be to say that there's some relation in virtue of which the regularities obtain. So this is a kind of strong view of Hume. We can't even wonder whether the world could be that way, right? We just don't have enough of a grip of what it is we're wondering for that to really count as an intelligible thought. A weaker view, actually, and now having heard Don's talk, I think I need to revise this a bit, which I wanted to ascribe to Don, and now I'm not so sure, was, look, we can suppose that these things exist, right? We can't kind of fully... we don't have a proper full-blown idea of them, but we can at least suppose, we can imagine the possibility that some kind of relation or other that underpins the regularities exist. Such relations conceivable, and this is the bit that I'm not sure about now, and hence epistemically possible. I take it actually because of what, so Don said earlier that, look, we could suppose, like, for example, right, so to suppose something is, to, as it were, kind of act as though you believed it, or something like that, right? So Don said, look, you could, in that sense, suppose that 2 + 2 was 5, right? In the sense that someone might say to you, look, imagine that 2 + 2 is 5. Now imagine that, you know, someone's just offered you £100 to successfully add up 2 + 2. What would you say, right? Answer 5. Okay, so that kind of view about what we can conceive or suppose, I take it, makes that what we are able to intelligibly suppose kind of comes away from what's epistemically possible, right? So I take it that insofar as what I just said about 2 + 2 = 5 makes sense, that doesn't commit us to the idea that it's epistemically possible that 2 + 2 = 5, right? So I was running those two things together when I wrote this handout, and now it seems to me that I need to keep them apart. So I don't know what Don's view is, and maybe he can tell me later about whether supposing that there is some kind of causation underpinning relation between causes and effects amounts to its being epistemically possible that they exist or not. Because I'm now not sure what the answer to that is. I'm not sure very much hangs on this, but so whichever the strong interpretation and the weak interpretation you have, though I think you're going to sign up to the idea that for Hume, any such causation underpinning relation, some relation in virtue of which the regularities obtain, is just going to be completely idle when it comes to our conception of causation, right? Because that concept of causation is sensitive only to nature's regularities, right? From the point of view of the truth and falsity of our causal claims, matters not whether these things exist, how they're distributed, you know, completely irrelevant. Okay, so now think about Lewis. Seems to me that there's room for just the same, well, a very similar kind of interpretive difference. So, as we've seen, for Lewis, intrinsic relations between distinct existences in general are only contingently bound, right? So when I said why it was that Lewis rejected endurantism in favour of perdurantism, it's because endurantism violates Humean supervenience, because it turns out that you have to believe in irreducible intrinsic relations between a thing and a time. But he thinks that's only contingently false, right? He thinks there are possible worlds where endurantism is true. So we have only a contingent ban on intrinsic relations, whereas intrinsic modal relations for Lewis are going to be necessarily banned, right? Because we have a possible world semantics according to which if you're in the intrinsic relation you're attempting to consider as a modal relation, you already know it couldn't possibly be instantiated, right? Because it would be modal and hence would, in order to be intelligible, be susceptible to a possible world analysis. So now let's think about that causation underpinning relation and ask whether we might intelligibly think about that, right? So the question isn't, right, so earlier on when I was saying, suppose you thought that natural necessity was kind of an intelligible notion, look, given Lewis's account of laws and his account of causation, the distribution of such a feature of some possible world would be completely irrelevant to what the truth, which law statements were true and which causal claims were true, right? So now the question is Lewis merely signed up to the thought that, look, we can kind of, look, maybe there are possible worlds where these things exist, but it kind of their existence or not is completely irrelevant to anything that we care about. Or does he have the stronger view that it really is unintelligible to suppose that those things exist kind of in any possible world? It's not completely clear to me what we ought to say. So here's a plausible interpretation of Lewis. Look, there are some, indeed epistemically possible worlds that contain intrinsic relations of some unspecified and for us unspecifiable nature maybe, that obtain between just those pairs of events that stand in causal relations, that's to say in the right patterns of regularity, right? So we might sign Lewis up to the thought that, look, there are possible worlds that do contain intrinsic relations that obtain between all of those events that in that possible world bear the causal relation to each other, right? Now, that those pairs of events stand in that relation is, as it were, irrelevant to the fact that they stand in causal relations, in the sense that what makes it true that they stand in causal relations is that they stand in the right relations of counterfactual dependence, and that isn't determined by the distribution of this unspecified intrinsic relation. Nonetheless, there could be such an intrinsic relation, right? That seems consistent with Lewis's overall view, right? There are possible worlds where, as it happens, all the events that are related as cause and effect stand in some intrinsic relation to each other, right? That could be true. So now we have a kind of weaker interpretation and a stronger interpretation of Lewis. The weaker view would be, well, look, okay, sure. So we're imagining these possible worlds where all of the causes and effects stand in some intrinsic relation. Maybe in some sense we can grasp the thought that those relations might somehow or other underpin causation, be the relation in virtue of which the regularities obtain, or something like that. It's just that that relation doesn't engage our concept of causation at all, right? So that would be to think that it's intelligible that there should be some causation underpinning relation, right? Not only intelligible, but I guess epistemically possible in that we don't know anything about the actual world that rules that out. It's just that the existence of this thing is kind of completely we shouldn't speculate about the existence of this thing because it doesn't matter to us, right? It doesn't actually play any role in the truth conditions for causal claims. That would be the weaker interpretation that kind of roughly correlates with the view that I rightly or wrongly just attributed to Don when it comes to Hume. And here's the stronger view, which I attributed to myself when it comes to Hume. Look, the notions of underpinning and in virtue of here, right? The idea that a relation somehow underpins the causal relations, or the idea that intrinsic relation is the relation in virtue of which the regularities obtain and hence things stand in causal relation to each other, are just inherently modal notions, right? And hence, no possible intrinsic relation could underpin causation or be that relation in virtue of which those regularities obtain, right? Because again, that would be to postulate not just some intrinsic relation, nature unspecified, but some intrinsic relation that has a distinctively modal aspect to it. And we already know that there can be no such intrinsic relations once we've signed up to the possible world story about modality. Right, so that's kind of the end. What I want to claim then is that there really is a Humean heart to the thesis of Humean supervenience. Quite a lot of what goes under the heading of Humean supervenience doesn't really have very much connection with Hume, it seems to me. It's an interesting question why Lewis signs up to this thesis and exactly kind of what the driving philosophical motivations are behind it, but at least it seems to me that at least part of the motivation is something that's very similar to what's going on in Hume, right? That idea that the notion of natural necessity is unintelligible, maybe in some kind of weak sense or maybe in a much stronger sense, but that idea that natural necessity is not merely to be eschewed from our story about the nature of the actual world, but in some sense really doesn't make any sense to us, I think is common to Lewis and Hume. And also you get just the same kind of interpretative issue concerning the extent to which we're able to imagine that these things might exist, even though we've already given up on the idea that they play any role in our causal talk or thought. Okay, that's the end. Thank you.